Okay, we are getting close to the final step in the process of casting our alginate hands. So we have our alginate and our cavity that we created by putting our hand inside this bucket, and we're ready to cast the material inside of it. And in this case, it is plaster. So again, this is your plaster bag from the class. The plaster we are using, if you're curious, is called Pottery Plaster #1. And there are a variety of plasters that you can get. Many of you have maybe heard of Plaster of Paris, which you can get at most art supply stores or hardware stores. Plaster of Paris is similar to what we're using. It is just much softer. So it's a much softer mix and is more prone to breaking. And there are plasters that are much more durable once cast. Hydrostone or Hydrocal are plasters that sort of go a few steps beyond Pottery Plaster #1. And they also would be great for casting. We just happen to have Pottery Plaster #1 in the studio as sort of our main plaster that we use because it has so much variety in what you can do with it. So instead of this is approximately 2 pounds. A lot of the times for molds for slip casting purposes, I am very specific at the weight of the plaster, but when we're casting a hand object, we have a little bit of flexibility in terms of the water plaster ratios, but not as much as I was when I was mixing the alginate. So you do kind of want to stay close to the ratios that I am providing you here. The temperature of the water is important, and it's important that you read what the temperature preference is for the different plasters you are using because some want a little warmer and some cooler. In plaster specifically, the temperature of the water really affects the set time quite significantly. If you have very cold water, again, you turn the tap water on, you let it on cold for a minute, and then you try to mix the plaster, it's not that the plaster won't set, but it will take a very long time for it to set. And it might affect the final strength of the casting, not so much worrisome for our purposes, but in industry, it's really important that they have a strong mixture. If you use super hot water, it will set very fast. Like you might not get to mix it as much as you should mix it in order to get a consistent mixture. So the temperature that is recommended is basically 70 degrees. So room temperature water is kind of what you're looking for when you are mixing. And the time frames for mixing and plaster setting will vary greatly depending on that temperature of the water. Okay, so now let's talk about these ratios. 2 pounds of plaster are going into 24 ounces of water. You always add plaster to water. There's never an option to do the reverse, plaster to water. And once you start mixing, you can't say, I need more plaster or I need more water. It won't work. So you got to make sure that you have those ratios ready to go before you do it. Again, plaster is a nuisance dust. It's not a carcinogenic. But if you are using it a lot, you will want a respirator. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to slowly pour and sift the plaster into the water, and then I'm going to let it set for a couple minutes. So there's a soaking period that's really important. You want all the particles of plaster to be dissolved by the water. So I'm slowly kind of adding this in, kind of directing it a little bit around the sides. So you'll see in the top right, I added another video just to show you what it looks like when I'm sprinkling the plaster around the surface. You will also be able to see how the plaster looks white and then starts soaking and settling below the level of the water. This was from a different video that I made, so the timing is off, but essentially the process is the same. And please note that my hand never breaks the surface of the water. I'm just sprinkling the plaster on top. And then also, even if I think that I have my ratios like totally figured out, I still also eyeball what I'm doing. Like I'm looking at what I'm doing as I'm doing it. And if the plaster stops sinking into the water, I'm going to slow down a little bit. That might mean that I had more plaster than I thought that I did, or less plaster. I have a little bit of a mountain forming on one side, but it's dissolving pretty quickly. So what I'm talking about is that the plaster is coming above the surface of the water, and I can see that it's sort of that pure white color of the plaster. And then when I say it's starting to dissolve, you'll see it kind of turns this like creamy gray color as the water starts sucking up into the plaster. Plaster absorbs moisture, so it just sucks it up, and then it'll eventually, that mountain will kind of collapse. Now I am talking even more as I am mixing up this plaster, and I forgot that I actually like to use a cup to do this. It's a little less dusty, so maybe a little yogurt container. It's okay if this takes you a couple minutes to add the plaster to the water. It doesn't need to take you a couple minutes, but you have a little bit of wiggle room because of the soaking time. So if I got interrupted and had to go check on something, or if I got a phone call or whatever, I have a little bit of time before the plaster starts kicking in or settling to work with. So that's kind of beneficial to know. So you don't have to rush it. Okay, so I have added pretty much all this plaster into the water, and there is one short little mountain, and the rest of the surface I can kind of see the plaster sitting just below the surface of the water. So there's an observational element at play here. I still haven't started mixing, so I still could add a little bit more plaster. And my mountains have all sunk very quickly, and I can still see a little bit of a difference between the plaster and the water at the top. So I know that I have a little bit more that I could add, sprinkle in if I wanted. Okay. And just make sure it's off the side. Smaller batches, you can leave them soak for 5 minutes, but you don't need to. Like a minute is probably fine. So I'm well beyond where I need to be. But if you're mixing larger 5-gallon buckets, you'll want to soak for 3 minutes. You'll want that whole thing to soak before you start mixing it. In larger volumes as well, you would want to use a drill with a mixing bit, but the small volume we have here is just fine to mix by hand. Once I start mixing, then I kind of got to be ready to have all my other, I don't know, what do they say, ducks in a row or something. So I'm going to have my extra container, because what's left over from pouring into here is going to go into this container. And I'm going to have some newspaper handy for cleanup of this bucket. Again, if you don't have 2 containers, you could probably leave the excess settle in here, but I'm afraid you're going to end up with like a super thin disc. Okay, so I'm going to start mixing, and the mixing process with plaster is one where you do need to be pretty vigorous. Like you need a pretty good agitation happening. But if you get too aggressive, you're going to introduce a whole bunch of air bubbles into the plaster, and those air bubbles will show up in your casting. So in industry, they have vacuums that will suck the air, the bubbles out of the plaster. We don't have that, and so we have to have like a nice, thorough mixture, but not like splashing everything around. So try to keep it in the bucket is what I'm saying. I usually like to say that the plaster will feel a little grainy when I'm first starting to mix it. I'm also scraping along the edges, along the corners and the bottom, just to make sure that there's not clumps or lumps, or that I'm getting everything mixed properly. And then plaster likes to be described, I don't know. Plaster is often described in terms of dairy products, and I haven't really thought of anything else to translate that into, so I'm sorry if you don't drink milk and none of this makes sense. But there is another visual I can cue you into. But when you first start mixing your plaster, it's going to seem like skim milk. It's going to be really runny and really thin. As you continue to mix, it will go to 2%, and then it'll go into whole milk, and it might then go into whipped cream consistency before it's whipped. It will go into like a kefir stage. And eventually it will go into like more of a whipped cream, not as light and airy and delicious, but it will kind of hold its shape. And then it goes into that hardening cycle. I continue to mix until I get to another cue of a stage, which is if I can take my finger and go across the surface and it leaves an indent just for a second, I can see the line was made and then it kind of erases or disappears, then I know that it's ready to set very shortly thereafter, and that I better get ready to pour it. And once it goes from that sort of like liquid, runny, milky stage to this sort of wanting to thicken and harden up, it happens pretty fast. So you kind of have to be like ready to go. There's not a lot of messing around. And okay, so I'm getting closer to that. I'm again trying to sort of trace my finger into the plaster and see if I get a little wake, kind of like a little wave that then quickly dissolves. Okay, so I can see that now. So I'm just getting that excess plaster off my hand. I'm also using my newspaper. This is all happening very quick. I'm going to tap this. It's going to make some noise. This is to get air bubbles to rise to the surface. Some came to the surface. I'm going to just skim them off to the edge and pop them. And now I'm going to pour. You can see. So slow and steady. I could go halfway and just kind of move it around a little bit. I don't want to squish this too much. A little is okay. I can maybe even tap it. I can start to see some air bubbles rise to the surface. Okay. I don't like to over pour it. I like to pour it just to the top so that I get this cast. But sometimes if you overfill it, then you'll end up with the disc that was the bucket, and you kind of have this like extra round disc. And this is me tapping it to try to make sure that air bubbles are coming back from the fingertips. So this is cool. I can also see plaster has come up through the vent holes. So that's a good sign. If you had a super large mold and you couldn't actually lift it up, then you can hit the underside of your table with a rubber mallet or something. Okay, and before I forget, this excess plaster, it's getting a little thicker, but it's still working, is going to get poured into my excess container. It has filled it up this full of volume. That means that's how much excess I'll have to cast. And I can also get as much excess out of my bucket as possible. I would not use a kitchen spatula for plaster and then try to put it back in your kitchen. That would be a bad idea. So I usually just use my hands to scrape out the bucket. Get as much of that as I can in there. And I'll tap this too. So just to kind of not do what I did, although what I did worked out fine. You pour your plaster into your hand and then immediately pour your excess into your container here and then tap this a little bit. Then you can scrape out the bucket, put the excess in top, and kind of work back and forth with tapping. This is probably, though I don't want to tap as it's going through its heat cycle and setting. So I'm just going to leave these two things off to the side. Final component of this demo is cleanup of the plaster. So because I scraped most of the plaster out of here, there's not going to be a ton of cleanup, and that's great. When you have excess plaster and you don't know what to do with it, you don't want that to go down your drain at all. It will harden and it does not dissolve. So you will just fill your pipe up with plaster, and there's no like Drano that will fix it. So this never goes in your sink drain. I'm going to use newspaper to wipe away as much as I can. Okay, getting a lot cleaner inside the bucket. And I try to get as much plaster out of here with newspaper or paper towels into the trash before using my water, because the less settling and stuff that I have in there, the sort of easier it is to manage when I pour it off. Now, if you were to do a lot of plaster work, you could get like a 5-gallon bucket and you could have that setting aside as your sort of rinse water. But I found that it's surprising how sort of little of water I can get away with for cleanup of plaster at my home studio. So because I don't want a 5-gallon bucket of random water sitting around stinking up my garage, I just use little bits at a time. So you did see I grabbed a little bit of water with my newspaper, just using that to kind of give another little wipe. Hand is the next thing, so I will use the water in that bucket to clean off my hand as well and get as much of this off of my hands as I can, underneath my nails, etc., before I go to the kitchen sink or the laundry sink or whatever it is that you're using. You can wear gloves if you want when mixing. The plaster is very drying, and so I notice if I've been making a lot with plaster that my hands tend to get really dry and my nails tend to be more brittle and fragile, so you can wear gloves if that seems more suitable to you. Hands are clean. Go wash these with soap and water. The final thing, as I said, is this bucket of water. I mean, it's actually fairly clean, but I'm just always wanting to be more safe than sorry. I don't want to have to pay for a plumber. So I'm going to leave this settle overnight, and in the morning I'm going to come, and because it's night, and I'm going to take this out into my backyard, and I'm going to pour off the water that's off the top into the grass. And if a little plaster gets in there, it's totally fine. It's, as I said, primarily gypsum and calcium. And then the sludge that's at the bottom, I'll take newspaper and wipe it out of there and do a kind of cleaning like I do for this bucket. So that's your stage for plaster cleanup. Remember, it never goes down the drain. I'm sort of as clean as I can be before I'm going to go use a little bit of soap and water. But final little bit of cleanup. Fold these things up carefully. My plastic is like pretty clean, so I can reuse this for the next project. If it did get a little on it, I usually just kind of pick it up, gather it in the middle, and toss that. And again, try to save and reuse my drop cloths as much as I can. Final little thing that's kind of cool to note about plaster is it does go through a heat cycle as it hardens. And that means it will actually get fairly warm. Now, pottery plaster number 1 is not going to get so hot that if I touch it, it is going to burn me. Some of the plasters can get hot enough to burn by touching the outside of it. But because plaster heats up, you don't want to use it for casting on your skin because you could get a pretty severe burn if you aren't careful. So if you think about my hand, well, I would never put it in a solid chunk of plaster, but if I put a little bit of plaster on the top of my hand as it was hardening, it would heat up and I could probably get some pretty severe burns. So pay attention to the materials that you are using and know what they should be used for and what's the right material for the job. The next thing is this needs to set for at least 3 hours. That's usually a pretty good time range before you can take the hand and the alginate out and sort of unearth your hand. You can wait longer than 3 hours. Like I said, it's night and I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to come back in the morning to take this out. So that's going to be like 7 or 8 hours, 9 hours. And it would probably still be totally fine by then. But what I'm going to do just to kind of help mitigate that is maybe I'm just going to take my plaster Ziploc bag, and it's empty. So I'm just going to set that over the top of this. And that's going to help keep the alginate soft. I'm not worried about the plaster. The plaster will continue to harden. But the alginate, we want that to sort of maintain its kind of moisture. So I'm just going to put this over the top and I'm going to come back in the morning and that'll be the final, one of the final demos is basically unearthing this from the form. Maybe I'll actually open it up just to show you. It sets fairly quickly once it starts to set. And I would recommend you wait a little bit longer. I'm just trying to utilize my video time with you sort of wisely. So this is one of the reasons a milk container is really cool to work with, is it just peels away. But if you use like a yogurt container, usually the block will slide out or you can cut into it. Because we are going to be carving into these actually will be nice if they have a little moisture in them. So I'm going to suggest that hopefully if your shape is the right size, I mean, you'll have about this much volume left over, that you store it inside of another one of your maybe empty Ziploc bags, like still have the alginate one. And if I can keep a little bit of moisture in this until we're ready to carve it, which will be in a week, that will help out just a little bit. So seal that one up, and this one you can just loosely bag. I'll be back tomorrow to unearth it. Thank you. Have fun with this step. Where is my remote? Okay, take care.